And we're on.
Okay. Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the IDS Annual Lecture 2024. I'm Peter Taylor. I'm Acting Director here at the Institute of Development Studies, and it's really a huge welcome. It's great to see this room full. So welcome to all of those of you who are in the room and also all of those who are watching online to our IDS Annual Lecture. And today's lecture, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Professor Mariana Mazzucato, who will be speaking about rethinking growth, making economies work for the common good. Now, I'll introduce you in just a moment, but first, the inevitable housekeeping notices. Those of you who spend a lot of time at IDS will be familiar with our fire alarm system, but there is no fire drill planned. So if the fire alarm does go off, please make your way to the nearest marked exit. I think I'll do. There's one over there and there's one here at the door. We also have a hearing loop available in the room. So if you need to use that, select setting T. And for those watching online, the closed captions option is available on Zoom. I think those are the housekeeping notes to share. So I'm really delighted, Mariana, to welcome you to IDS. Why are we having this conversation today? Because in a time of rising global inequality, climate and water crises, and health pandemics, a big question arises: how can governments achieve growth that's more inclusive and sustainable? And how can a renewed focus on mission-oriented policies and common good economics help us understand how the public and private sectors can collaborate to achieve this goal? Big questions, which, Mariana, we're really looking forward to how you're going to help us to navigate those. But first, let me introduce you and welcome you properly to IDS. Mariana Mazzucato, PhD, is Professor in the Economics of Innovation and Public Value at University College London, where she's founding director of the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. I'm sure there'll be information will be shared about that later on as well. She's a winner of international prizes, including the Grande Fusiale Ordine al Merito della Repubblica Italiana 2021. Apologies for my pronunciation. Italy's highest civilian honor, the 2020 John von Neumann Award, the 2019 All-European Academy's Madame de Stael Prize for Cultural Values, and the 2018 Leontief Prize for Advancing the Frontiers of Economic Thought. And most recently, Pope Francis appointed her to the Pontifical Academy for Life for bringing more humanity to the world. She is a very accomplished and prolific author, as well as The Entrepreneurial State, Debunking Public versus Private Sector Myths. She's authored The Value of Everything, Making and Taking in the Global Economy, Mission Economy, a moonshot guide to changing capitalism, which I know we're going to hear more about. And more recently, The Big Con, how the consulting industry weakens our businesses, infantilizes our governments, and warps our economies. I think there should be a prize for some of the best titles as well. She advises policymakers around the world on innovation-led inclusive and sustainable growth. And her roles have included, for example, chair of the WHO Council on the Economics of Health for All, co-chair of the Global Commission on the Economics of Water, a member of the South African President's Economic Advisory Council, and co-chair of the group of experts to the G20 Task Force for the Global Mobilization Against Climate Change. We actually have some worn copies, which have just been shared with. So a really illustrious career, an amazing, prolific set of writing, and it's really exciting to hear from you today, Mariana. Just before you begin, just also like to welcome Carlota Perez, and Mariana's going to speak first, and following that, Carlota's going to share some reflections with us afterwards. And Carlota is Honorary Professor at SPRU, the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex Business School, and she studies the socio-economic impact of technical change and the historical context of growth and development. Her really long career has combined civil service, academic research and teaching, and she's acted as a consultant for several Latin American governments, for international organizations like UNIDO, CEPAL, the Andean Pact, World Bank, the OECD, and many global corporations. She's the author of the influential Technological Revolutions and Financial Capital, The Dynamics of Bubbles and Golden Ages, and is currently working on a sequel, analyzing the roles that government, business, and civil society play in the deployment of technological potential. And aside from her affiliation to SPRU here at the university, Carlota is currently Honorary Professor at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, University College London, Adjunct Professor of Technology and Development at the Norxa Institute, Taltech, Estonia, and Academic in Residence at Anthemis, UK. So Carlota, you're also very welcome, and we look forward to hearing from you in a little while. But first, we're going to hear Mariana from you, then Carlota, and then there will be chance for questions following that. Mariana, over to you.
And she's my best friend, my auntie, Zia. You can't hear us or you can hear us? You were making. Okay, can you hear me? Does this work or is this just for the outside people? Can you hear? Otherwise, you know what I'm going to say. I always say the same thing. My father always says, "You're always saying the same thing." I'm like, "Yeah, but it's different audiences." Yeah, anyway, you guys can hear? I'll try to speak loudly. So first of all, thank you for inviting me. Not only because I discovered that you're a supporter of my second favorite team. I'm an Arsenal supporter, but I do love Liverpool. You never walk alone. Do not tell my kids that I've said this because they think there's only Arsenal. I can't believe Brighton is number 3. Like, is that a thing? Didn't even know they had a soccer team. Anyway, but also because I definitely left a piece of my heart here, not only because of wonderful friends, some of them in the room, but also definitely what brought me to Sussex was, in fact, the fact that Chris Freeman was here, that Carlotta was here, Keith Pavitt was here, where thinking about innovation and development at the center of an economy, how do we transform, how do we rethink markets instead of thinking that market pressures are here and we need to do the good stuff outside of markets, as some people argue, how do we redefine the market, redefine the economy, redirect growth? I really feel that, Sprue in its heyday was very much the center of that. And also I knew IDS less, but I actually gave, I think, some sort of annual lecture here. It was in this room. Melissa Leach had invited me. And when I work around the world, and I work in many countries with civil servants, thinking about a lot of the issues that I'll talk about today, there's always someone from IDS who pops up. And it's always someone who's been kind of trying to push the needle, who's, being a thorn in the side of the system and not just kissing up to different people, trying to make them all happy. So a huge honor to be here. Are they going to come up at some point? Yep. Good, great. And I was saying that I think I even left something in my office. I'm going to go later. It was like a really nice stapler or something. But no, I left in 2018, so it's been a long time. I haven't been here. So what I'd like to talk about, and I think this is relevant for people like yourselves who think a lot about development at the center, structural change, not development on the side, where then the economic growth stuff is done somewhere else. I think this will be very relevant, but I'm especially interested in hearing your experience, also hearing what you're doing. We were just talking with Peter on your own research group on participatory mechanisms. I know very little about that, but I know it's hugely important. I would actually argue that the reason that Trump won, but let's not start talking about that because that will never finish, that little parentheses, is precisely because even though the Biden policies were actually quite successful in the red states, in the Trump voting states, the way that we do good economic policy is actually not with people. There's very little participation. There's even very little communication, let alone participation. And that's something that's gotten very much, me worried in many ways, not just because of electoral results, but also because the work that we do in my Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, trying to bring this idea of outcomes orientation. I will guide you through what I mean by that. If it's done at people and not with people, not only does it not work, but it causes distrust. And we were talking with Annabelle before, who couldn't be here. She had to go off, how she thinks that this is a huge problem right now, even in progressive countries like Chile, where we have Boric, Colombia, where we have Petro, two people who are, two presidents, prime ministers who are leading those countries with a progressive agenda, but there's a lot of distrust in communities because of historically what has happened, for example, around mining and so on. So even if we want ecological transitions and it sounds good and the green industrial strategy, if we don't combat that severe distrust that so many people, including in the United States of America, have for the political process, the policymaking process, and businesses, then it's going to be impossible to actually, I think, foster the kind of more inclusive and sustainable growth through the kind of smart policies that I'm sure we're all interested in. And I think we have to be humble. Like, we need to actually admit what we don't know. And that bit about the participatory structures, I only have to learn. And I was saying that actually I've learned more about that just working with Camden Council, the part of London where I live, than I have anywhere else, because it's a very small place. I've lived there for 20 years. There's 250,000 people. It's actually the size of Barbados, which I'm also working, a small island state or a large ocean state. But that interaction, for example, that the leader of Camden Council, her name was Georgia Gould, that's still her name, but now she's an MP and working in the cabinet office. It was so interesting for me to see how working with her around this mission-oriented approach for a local area in the UK also meant taking much more seriously than I had ever seen, working with and not at, and bringing the so-called different stakeholders, but also really listening, empathy, not sympathy, listening, and even designing policies with those people who will then experience those policies. So the whole notion of outcomes-oriented procurement, which I'll talk about in a minute, was done in Camden with carers and carees in the adult social care program, which was revolutionary, actually allowing voice and the real co-creation of the policies by the people who experience the policies. And how to do that for real instead of tokenistically is just fascinating to witness. And again, for me, I'm learning about that. There's nothing I can teach you about it. Definitely, I'm interested in your group and having this really be a beginning of a conversation. So I put the common good word in the title because I'm currently in theory on sabbatical. It's not working. Sabbatical, you're supposed to be able to think when there's too much doing and traveling to actually work with others around the world. It's hard to write a book, but between January and June, I will actually write this book. So again, on that bit of the talk, I'm just going to give you some flavor of what I've been thinking about. I'm still very much in the middle of writing that book, but instead of jumping to that, I want to give you a bit of the sense of the trajectory that I've been on and why I believe we actually need a new economics of the common good. Not the public good, which is just a correction for some sort of market failure where the private sector is not investing, but the common good as an objective, where the how we all interrelate and interact matters as much as the what. And I've been having to read a lot of political philosophy, which is interesting because I've always had a bit of insecurity on the philosophy side. Why am I telling all these random things? I will start, but because, anyway, my husband is Italian, and in Italy, in state schools, you actually learn philosophy, proper philosophy. And I went to an American school where we played a lot of sports for 3 hours after school, so I have better muscle mass. But anyway, I do think philosophical thinking, critical thinking is incredibly important amongst our youth today who are challenging us at all levels. Think of the Fridays for the Future, but really also being able now to think about how weak actually this notion of the common good is in economics, and yet what a long history it's had in philosophy has also been a humbling experience. Anyway, moving on. So I often begin my talks with this slide, which you've probably seen. It's a cartoon image that started to circulate after COVID, just because we literally are going from crisis to crisis to crisis. These crises are interconnected. Think of, a lot of the scientific research that has linked the health pandemics with climate change. But I just came back from Cali in Colombia because of the COP16 on biodiversity. There's a huge biodiversity crisis. There's a water crisis. The global hydrological cycle has become very unstable. It's related to the climate crisis. And yet we not only don't have proactive ways of thinking about these crises, but we haven't really thought of them as interconnected. Right, so the systemic and interconnected nature of these crises, including, of course, the financial crisis, which itself was a result of very problematically designed economies. And by the way, the financial crisis is hardly over. You will remember that the financial crisis in 2008 came about not because of public sector debt, but because of private sector debt and the kind of casino capitalism, which Carlotta writes about so eloquently. The level of private debt to disposable income in this country is basically back at very similar levels that it was when the crisis exploded, the bubble exploded, and yet hardly anyone is talking about it. And in fact, every time there is a crisis like COVID and we have lockdown, people are given loans, right? Help to buy schemes, and let's recover by giving small companies loans or help people through loans when they are already indebted up to here. Right? So if real incomes aren't rising and we're just increasing the amount of credit and debt in the system, and if, as in this country, 80% of finance goes back to finance, insurance, and real estate, handily that acronym is FIRE. So the climate is on fire, but so is our financial system. Then obviously we are just sort of setting ourselves up for the next potential financial crisis. And again, Carlotta's new book and also her old book, which looked at the is this me causing this microphone stuff? Coevolution of productive capital and financial capital. If you haven't read it, read it. But also, you know, this kind of complete inertia, the fact that we're actually going backwards in, especially after the recent energy crisis, where people have rediscovered nuclear and somehow gas is even now seen as like a cool thing to go back to. So we have, you know, this big study every year. I think now it's off. The IPCC study, what's it called? UOs, right? Interpanel climate change, intergovernmental panel for climate change. IPCC report, really important. Many people in this university have actually contributed to it, which says we don't have time. We literally have like about 5 or 8 years left until we've actually passed that tipping point. And if you think of what led so many students globally, high school students, you know, Greta Thunberg and so many other young people to strike on Fridays and to call out I don't know how many generations are in here. I always think we're all the same age. Even with my kids, I'm like, I treat their friends like they're my friends. But anyway, this generation has not, definitely our generation has not acted with the urgency that we require to take that challenge seriously. They're absolutely right. If you look at all the different statistics, including the fact that during COVID, so many of the loans were actually given to projects that are part of the climate problem. And we seem never to know how to actually use these crises as moments of real reflection on how to do things differently. There's this concept of building back better that we all started to use. Of course, we didn't do that. We just went back to normal. And so many of the tools, which is so interesting, and I'll come to these later, that during COVID, people remembered we could use, like outcomes-oriented procurement to procure in the vaccines or the personal protection equipment that countries needed when all these health workers were dying. Should I go back? Because you're going to start reading that. You don't know what I'm talking about. We then stopped doing that after COVID, right? So thinking proactively and not reactively is something that we somehow only know how to do in wars or when millions of people are dying and we wake up and know how to, you know, structure our tools a bit differently. And yet in normal times, we don't do that. And that's part of the reason we get these crises. And I have had the, pleasure to work with the UN in recent years. I know many of you probably in IDS have been doing that for decades. For me, it's relatively new. I'd been on different kind of panels and commissions, but working, you know, directly with the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, and the Deputy Secretary General, Amina Mohammed, around this idea of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 of them, and the 169 targets beneath them as being central and having to come actually to the center. So they have, you know, they were important. They didn't come about as top down from the UN. They were actually in many ways, I don't want to say co-created, that would be too strong, but came out of lots of consultation globally. They, you know, landed in countries to be signed up to or not in 2015, but there's been very little progress on most of them. In fact, if you read the recent reports, what's it called? The most recent SDG report that they presented at the Summit of the Future last year, we've actually gone backwards in many of these. And I've been very interested in how, in reaction to that going backwards around the goals, this notion that actually we need kind of a new economics, a new way of talking about our collective challenges. There's all these very strong words that are being used to talk about that. So in particular, the Secretary General has been talking about our common agenda. The Pope, I usually have, now I'm going to blame you. Carlotta told me I had way too many slides, so I took out a lot of slides, and then I always regret having taken them out. This was actually one you didn't tell me to take out, but I took it out, which was the next slide actually had some interesting words from the Pope. I'm not very religious. In fact, when I met him, he said, Mariana, me dicen que no eres muy religiosa. You know, Mariana, they tell me you're not so religious. But I've been very interested and have had the honor to meet him as well, because he also talks a lot about the problems in modern day capitalism and, you know, running the Vatican, which has such a important presence globally in terms of his message. Super interesting how he's been using in his Laudato Si and encyclicals this concept of the common good, right? So these words like common, collective problems need a common agenda. We are failing in global capitalism. We need to reinvent the common good. And the more I looked at that concept, I'm like, but we don't actually have an approach to the common good in economics that is kind of serious, that really takes seriously collective problems, common problems, and then backtracks and asks, what does it mean for how we design the economic system to deliver on those problems? So bringing the SDGs at the center instead of the periphery. Or think of the nationally determined contributions, which every country is supposed to be kind of coming up with their contribution to fight climate change. They are often far away from the center of how we think about the economy. So what does it mean to actually talk about these problems and find solutions to them, not as cute little projects here and there, but actually design the economic system in a problem and solutions oriented way, not in this fuzzy, oh, we're all in it together, let's get cute little public-private partnerships. In fact, it's weird. I tend to cringe when I hear the word public-private partnership. So when you said it, it is what I'm going to talk about, but I kind of cringe because they've been so distorted. We have the wrong kind of partnerships, right? Think of the PFI schemes in this country, the public financing initiatives, which were really problematic in the health sector. And we don't define what kind of partnership do we want, right? If you're in a relationship with someone, you would never just say that the partnership is necessarily good. You would probably give a bunch of descriptions of, what you do on weekends, and I won't go into the details, but the kind of fun stuff that I'm sure you all do with your partners. And you might actually say, I've got a bad partnership, and you'll tell people why, and you go off with your girlfriends or boyfriends and talk about it. And so the concept of ecosystem, which in the innovation world, we have some innovation gurus here, and the STS, which, okay, I'll give you my critique of STS maybe in the Q&A. But the kind of innovation world, we talk about innovation ecosystems and never define what are we actually talking about. Is the ecosystem predator-prey? Is it parasitic? Is it mutualistic? Is it symbiotic, right? A biologist would define that rigorously, whereas in economics, and especially in the innovation world, which both Carlotta and I have been critical friends of, we have gotten very lazy with that word, right? So what does it mean to have a common agenda? This word that others are using at these very high levels, like the UN, the Pope, leaders, Lula, talking about that we need a common purpose and common collective systemic actions in order to fight climate change. What does it mean to actually take it seriously, to drive economic growth with the direction, to put collective intelligence, so real collaboration, not collective intelligence like a slogan, but to ask, well, what does that mean in terms of sharing knowledge, sharing learning, instead of privatizing every little bit of our innovation chains towards SDG related goals and actually defining ecosystems on whether they are parasitic, as we know there's many. I've looked at the health sector for a long time, and believe me, I often tell my husband if I don't come home at night, it was Pfizer, because I've been bitching about Pfizer for a very, very long time, way before COVID, right? So how do we actually have in the health area, and the climate area, and our digital governance areas, true mutualistic, kind of good partnerships, not the problematic partnerships? Sorry, this is the very self-promotional bit, which is kind of my journey. Right? So for me, it all began kind of in rethinking the state, not because the state is more important than any other agent, but because I think it's been the most mis-theorized or also boringized, right? If we think of the state as at best fixing markets, at best facilitating, enabling, de-risking, the word I hate the most, because you actually should welcome uncertainty, share risk, share rewards, and de-risking sets you up for failure. That's why blended finance models, I think, have failed. We've socialized risks, privatized rewards. If at best we even talk about central banks during the financial crisis, they literally saved the day, and yet we call them lenders of last resort, right? Like, oh, how boring can we get, right? As opposed to what? Again, sharing risk, sharing rewards, shaping markets, not just fixing markets. Not facilitating, which means making something easier for someone, right? Facile. How many of you are from Latin-speaking countries? Psh, no people from Latin America? Okay, okay, right? Facile makes, that's where facilitating comes from. Very different from what Kennedy said with the moon landing. We're doing it because it's hard, not because it's easy. What does it mean to do something because it's hard? It's definitely not facilitating it for someone else, right? So all the words that we've thought about in terms of the state have not only been boring, but have also set it up, I think, to fail. So in the entrepreneurial state, I tried to better understand, well, what has the state done in the few times, few places, where actually really led and shaped markets, not as rosy pictures, because a lot of things went wrong, even in those places, but just what did it mean also for the intra-organizational culture, and what does it mean for our ability to actually understand not only history, but the future? What kind of decentralized network of public institutions driven by notions of public purpose and public value do we need to foster a real green revolution? But the main thing here was to debunk basically Silicon Valley, because all the innovation actually came from state-funded agencies, and yet we then privatize their rewards. Just look at what's happening today in big tech. The reason they're able to hire the top people from the top universities today, the top AI people are going to work in big tech because of these massive rents that they've been able to accrue over the last decades, benefiting from all sorts of publicly funded technology, the internet, GPS, touchscreen, Siri, AI. The early history of AI was all government funded, and they don't even pay their tax. I don't have to tell you this, you guys know this. In many cases, very problematic corporate governance structures in terms of financialization, but also think of Amazon's relationship with the labor force. So I could go on and on, but the point is that these things matter, right? To actually understand where does this wealth come from, so that we can also share that wealth more socially. You need to have a different understanding of where wealth comes from in the first place. We can't just think of redistribution. We need pre-distribution, and understanding actually these ideas of collective value creation are very important. And that's what I tackled in The Value of Everything. What does collective value creation mean? What's the difference between value creation and value extraction? Profits versus rents, a big discussion for classical political economists. And I won't give you the lecture here, but the sum there is that if we don't even talk anymore about value creation versus value extraction and value destruction, we risk confusing profits with rents. And so what we end up in GDP is actually with a lot of rents. So I often say, instead of just bringing in happiness indicators, let's first take out so much of the problematic stuff that we've put in just because it had a price. Right? So we confuse prices and value. Mission economy, which is I'll talk about today, was just really the lessons from this in terms of policy design. So I won't say more because I'll talk about it in a second. And the big con was really about none of the stuff that we're interested in: development, structural change, innovation with a purpose. So directed growth can happen with weak state capacity. If every time we have a riforma della pubblica amministrazione in Italy, it sounds great because everything sounds good in Italian, it just ends up being cuts and cuts and cuts, and not retraining and thinking of agility, flexibility, what my colleague Reiner Cattell calls creative bureaucracies, then it's going to be impossible to govern this. It'll be impossible to have those dynamic public-private partnerships if the public bit thinks it's just there to de-risk and hasn't even invested in its head and has consultified and outsourced a lot of the knowledge. The problem in the big con was not to say consultants are bad. It's if you bring consultants to the center, actually doing what governments should be doing, as opposed to advising on the sides and not investing in the capacity and the brains of the civil service, how are we going to do the most complex, wicked challenges of our time? How will we partner well? And the common good stuff, which again is what I'm kind of arrived to, is that my experience with especially the entrepreneurial state and mission economy is that a lot of policymakers are like, oh, wow, great, this sounds like fantastic. And I often walked in as an economist and came out as a life coach because I just made them happy. Literally, like people would say, oh, thanks, you make me want to wake up again, right? Because there's been so much bashing of the civil service. David Cameron, by the way, I opened up the entrepreneurial state with this quote where he said, civil servants are the enemies of enterprise, right? We just need to or what Musk is now doing in DOGE, doggy? Is that what you and so there's just been, over the last 40 or 50 years, not just the neoliberal economics, but it's really filtered down through new public management, public choice theory, convincing a lot of civil servants that not only at best they can fix markets, but they have to be constantly worried about government failure. So all this de-risking and risk averseness, which ultimately also has fed that consulting addiction. And my experience was that even where it took off, am I already done? Oh my God, it's like slide 3 of 100. But anyway, I promise I'll finish on time. You said 40 minutes, right? I got plenty of time. At some point, I'll get to the real story. So I'm just basically telling you my life. But for me, it's important because I'm kind of rehearsing. Why am I writing this book again? Is that I actually have come to believe that it's impossible to build entrepreneurial states. It's impossible to have good public-private partnerships, those symbiotic public-private partnerships, if the way we talk about good is just a correction for something, right? And I'm talking about economists, by the way. I know that this notion of the common good and the commons, even though I critique the commons in this paper, which I think we circulated, I'm not sure, it's this paper I wrote called Governing the Economics of the Common Good, from Correcting Market Failures to Shaping Collective Goals. My critique is that the public good ends up just being a correction for something that the private sector doesn't do, and we justify it through when you have high positive externalities, so when there's these good things that we should be investing in, but if you invest in it, the spillovers are so large so that no private sector has the incentive to invest in it because of the, you've studied this stuff, due to the non-rival, non-exclusive characteristics of the good. If at best you're then filling the gap of that, we end up with these ideas that, oh, the SDGs have a financial gap that we need to fill. 7 trillion, huge, right? There's a gap, there's like a hole we just need to fill with money. Or the opposite, if you have too much private sector investment in areas, we talk about it with the opposite, negative externalities that then again need to be patched up with something like a carbon tax. And of course we need carbon taxes. And of course we need to be investing in those things that the private sector is not willing to, which we know are good. But if we're just always patching things up, we literally get patchy policies by design, right? Not by accident, by design. We've had this idea of market failures or system failures if you're at SPRU, right? So different types of system failures, but again, it's just a failure that we need to fix. So you literally go around with these bandages, and it's not surprising then that we don't invest in the civil service because they just need bandages. They're not at the center. They don't need to help co-create and shape an economy. And I had already talked about that in a lot of my work in terms of we need a market shaping, not market fixing, blah, blah, blah. But in my recent experience, it was more like, well, we need to then redefine good. How can we talk about good just as a correction? What would it look like if it's actually about these objectives like the SDGs, but much more interpreted locally, right? Because the SDGs are out there. Every country signed up to them, but they need to be interpreted. What does it mean for a city, a neighborhood, a region, a country, and of course, those global problems. And so the idea that actually we need some sort of dashboard around what does it mean for how we bring directionality in an explicit way? Even deregulation brings a direction to the system. So there's always directionality, but how do we actually talk about it and frame it? What does it mean to co-create? And these are all things that I'll bring up in a second, but the co-creation and true participation, which Peter's team here looks at, collective learning and knowledge sharing. If we actually live in the 21st century defined by knowledge and collective intelligence, well, we should have a metric that captures, are we really sharing knowledge? We didn't share knowledge during COVID. We ended up with vaccine nationalism or vaccine apartheid, which is what Dr. Tedros called it. Access for all and reward sharing. How do we actually share the profits, the wealth that we create collectively? What are the mechanisms? When does it work? When does it fail? What do we know about it? And true transparency and accountability. So I've kind of told you about this. This is what I'm currently writing about, and I'll come back to this at the end, even though I'm almost done, when I talk about the need for me, at least, to really learn much more about these participatory. How do we, in the same way that when Aristotle talked about the telos, the goal, and the polis, the participation, and kind of the democratic deliberation, how do we take that really seriously so the how we interact, how we work together, how we innovate, how we finance matters as much as that kind of ultimate objective. So think of climate. We might be going after net zero policies, or during COVID, we need these, vaccines, and we need to, but what happens when we just think about the vaccine? We end up with 8, but how we produced it, how we structured the so-called innovation collaborations became part of the problem. So taking a lot, putting a lot of emphasis on intellectual property rights, structure of finance, not financial gaps, looking at the way that different actors are or are not collaborating, I think just requires a more rigorous approach and a sort of a dashboard. And so now I'll talk about kind of the work that we've been doing, again, in the Institute. I think only Saul is here from the Institute, but the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, where on the back of the work, entrepreneurial state, emission economy, where these ideas were catching on, where I think there was kind of thirst, they came out at the right time, where there was a lot of desire to go after these big challenges, and the experience, if you want, that we've had in trying to implement some of these ideas of outcomes orientation, symbiotic public-private partnerships, and paying attention to the how, the structure of finance, not the financial gap, the shaping of markets to lead to good outcomes, not market fixing here and there. And the reason I wrote Mission Economy was that if you actually unpack the Apollo program, it was more a political economic program than just an aerospace one. The first thing that they did, well, first of all, the language that was used is what I found, and I'll just say it. Yes, it was military industrial complex, but we'll get to that in a minute. But the point is, for war and the Apollo program as part of that military industrial complex machinery, it was so interesting how they actually paid a lot of attention to the tools, to the how. So the mission, well, the challenge was space race, beat the Russians. The mission was to the moon and back in a short amount of time. So very clear direction that you could actually answer yes or no, did you achieve it? But the language that was used, if you think of Kennedy's speeches, was very much of, we're doing it because it's hard, not because it's easy. It's going to cost us a huge amount of money. We're probably going to fail along the way, right? And they did fail along the way. They had that Apollo 1 disaster where those 3 astronauts died, and they used that disaster to change their bureaucracy. They realized they were completely not fit for purpose. They were a typical government institution where they weren't talking between departments. I know my university doesn't talk between departments, and it kills me, right? Like these complaints we all have of bureaucracy. NASA was completely bureaucratic, and one of the guys who died, Gus Grissom, burnt to death, along his 2 colleagues in that lunar module, just yelled out, literally while they were dying, how the beep beep are we going to get to the moon if we can't even talk between 2 or 3 buildings? They took that as a challenge for thinking, okay, of course, we need a purpose-oriented organization, means that we need all the different project managers to have their independent teams, but in constant communication with each other. So any goal-oriented government needs to have constant communication between the different departments. The first thing they did was change how they did procurement. They knew they had to work massively with the private sector. It wasn't state or private, but it was on goals. Right? They had all these different problems that they had to solve. The solutions to those problems got us camera phones, foil blankets, baby formula, baby diapers. Right? These were all solutions, technological solutions to problems that NASA had, which it worked with the private sector in this outcomes-oriented way. And by the way, this created growth. Why? Because you need investment, innovation, training in order to solve a problem. Growth was not the mission. Here, Starmer, listen, right? He's got 5 missions. The first one is growth. Like, no. Growth is the result if you actually can catalyze public and private and other investments to solve big problems. But how did they do this? It wasn't just public-private partnership. They changed procurement. One of the key tools that governments have, whether you are Barbados or Brazil, a huge chunk of a government budget is wasted often. It's often 30% of a government budget. So they knew that they had to use this budget well. It wasn't just going to be contracts. It's interesting, by the way, words like in Italy, procurement is just appalto, which is basically just a contract. Whereas I like the word procurement because there's a bit of desire, right? You're procuring solutions to problems that you have. You can turn it into a verb. Appalto can't even be turned into a verb. But the problem is, what do you want? What are you even trying to do? Do you want like Sweden, healthy, tasty, sustainable school meals? Well, you're going to have to procure that in, and that's going to require innovation, investment, training, changing the food supply chains, and so on. So any procurement budget can be used either as just money given out. Not surprising, a lot of corruption happens in procurement, so much so that in Italy, where corruption has been one of our great, anyway, history of the mafia is very interesting on that. But in Italy, procurement, because that's where a lot of corruption happened, is actually in an agency for anti-corruption now. So l'Agenzia Nazionale dell'Anticorruzione. So just because corruption happens in procurement, you don't then straitjacket it and make it do nothing. Ironically, that can actually create more corruption because you no longer even know what you're desiring, what you're trying to do, what's the public purpose. So it's an interesting dilemma. Of course, we need to fight corruption, but not by straitjacketing one of the key tools, which makes it even more risk averse. So they changed procurement from cost plus procurement, which was just leading to no innovation and hiking up the bills, to NASA, towards mission-oriented, challenge-oriented, fixed-price procurement with incentives for innovation and quality improvement. And that was key to foster all that collaboration around problems and also to make it fair, this idea of no excess profits, basically no rents. Again, going back to the physiocrats, Adam Smith, Karl Marx, David Ricardo, who actually talked a lot about rents. Think about inflation in the last 3 years. Where did it come from? Rents and excess profits being earned in energy and food. Isabella Weber has some great studies on this. NASA, which knew its worth, knew what it was doing, actually put into the contracts because it was confident of its role. It wasn't just de-risking. All right, this is going to be a fair game. Not going to turn this into casino contracts, casino capitalism. And so the work that we've been doing is actually then unpicking what would this look like if we actually applied it to normal problems, right? Not just going to the moon and back in a short amount of time, but to, again, turning those SDGs or even just any problems that a country thinks it has around healthy aging, around health for all issues, around net zero, around reducing the digital divide. What does it mean in terms of the design of policy, the design of institutions like procurement, but also like public banks? There's 20.2 trillion, that's a lot of money, in national development banks. Are they outcomes oriented or just giving out money to whoever begs for it? The new social contract between public and private actors, again, to measure, is there reciprocity in the contract? Is it outcomes oriented, or are we just doing the British PFI schemes, which we know were hugely problematic because there was no very clear outcome that then required the private sector, which entered the health sector, to deliver on very important purpose-oriented and public value-oriented metrics. Co-creation and participation, how do we make sure it's not just Kennedy and the boys telling us all what the missions are, but especially at the local level, really bringing different people to the table to think about it and to kind of come up with concrete missions that mean something to people, that actually also build consensus around them so they actually last beyond that particular political leader who might be in charge. The dynamic capabilities, hugely important. Really interesting right now, the work that we're doing in Brazil with Minister Esther Dweck, who is the head of the Ministry for Public Administration. So in her case, she has 3 big tools: procurement. I am obsessed about procurement, state-owned enterprises, and digital government. So you can either just do this stuff in a boring way, or what does it mean to really think about digital government, for example, governance, in terms of helping governments have that communication between the different ministries and departments. And then the global governance issues, this is the work that we've recently done in this report. This is great because this is a summary of the whole talk. I can actually stop here and not do my next 2,000 slides. The G20 report for TF Klima, which has just come out literally 2 weeks ago. I co-chaired this with Vera Songway. The idea here was, well, this all sounds fine and good, but what happens if this just turns into these nationalistic strategies? Think of the IRA in the US, a huge amount, trillions being spent on greening. This is pre-Trump. We'll see what happens, especially because most of that money went to Trump voting states. So I think there'll be more stability than we think. But what happens when our Green Inflation Reduction Act, because of the subsidies, just sucks money out of green capital, out of, for example, the African continent? How can we have global justice, equity, design of the global agenda so we don't have vaccine apartheid and green IRA nationalism? So these are the kind of things we've been very interested in. And again, the kind of work that we've been doing has been very much around the kind of details and learning what goes wrong. What recently went wrong in Brazil is that McKinsey came back and somehow convinced the Confederation of National Industry, their business fora, to lobby the government. Actually, it was the opposite. The Confederation asked McKinsey to help them lobby to bring back this approach just to sectors. No, bring back the goal not to an ecological transition that requires economy-wide transformation, and that's the kind of key mission, but actually bring it back to kind of a sectoral approach where we start thinking of key sectors like agribusiness and maybe renewable energy. So not goal-oriented, but sector-oriented. What's key in a mission-oriented approach is very much thinking about what are the goals, what does it mean for all sectors in terms of transforming production and distribution in that direction. So maybe I'll just take 5 more minutes. Is that okay?
Yeah.
In terms of policy design, I've already said it. What is an outcomes-oriented mission approach, in my opinion? And I think this is important, by the way, because otherwise that word just gets used and it's old wine in new bottles. So very specifically, you begin with a challenge like climate, you turn it into a very clear mission, but not so narrow that then it just requires one sector like renewable energy, a cross-sectoral approach in the same way that the moon landing was aerospace, nutrition, materials, electronics, and so on. And there's problems then that need to be solved. What would the astronauts wear? How would they move? What would they eat? Which define all the different problems that are definitely set by public, purpose kind of oriented, how do you say, design, but that require private sector innovation. So bottom up, private sector and public sector and third sector innovation, where the sum then is greater than the parts. In Europe, right? So we don't confuse the challenge with the mission. Climate change is the challenge. The mission would be like net zero. Here, let me give you some examples here. So 100 carbon neutral European cities by 2030 is the work that I did with the Commission, the European Commission, on the back of which there's now 5 mission areas in Europe. That then requires lots of different sectors, from transport, food, construction, to innovate and invest. But they only do that if there's actually conditionality or reciprocity at the center of contracts. So the reason there's green steel in Germany is not because the steel sector went to Davos to talk about purpose, but because the public bank called the KfW in Germany put that as a condition for a loan program, because they had a very clear Energiewende policy that then required all sorts of sectors, including steel, so not just renewable energy, to invest and to innovate. So putting that level of conditionality on procurement, on public loans, keeping open the how. If you tell everyone what to do, you don't get innovation, you don't get entrepreneurship. Clear direction on the what we need to solve, but very open on the how, which of course also means that there will be failure along the way. In this water report, I always walk around with lots of propaganda. This is the Global Commission on the Economics of Water commission that I just co-chaired with the head of the WTO, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, and Tarman Shanmugam, the president of Singapore, and Johan Rockstrom. The idea was also to always say all the big problems that the SDGs are kind of addressing are actually global problems. We need to confront these with, again, collective collaboration between countries, because deforestation in the Amazon and in forests and the biodiversity problem has been found to directly actually impact floods and droughts in other parts of the world. So the global hydrological cycle by design connects us. And that's around the global governance issues we address, but also what we say is that we need a mission-oriented approach, and we came up with 5 different missions, like the one of a new green revolution in food systems, for example, reducing water use in agriculture by 1/3 while increasing crop yields. But what's interesting is that at the contract level, there's so much that could be done. There's 80% of industrial wastewater is not recycled. And yet the water rights are being given by the state to the private sector, to PepsiCo and Anheuser-Busch. And it wouldn't take much to say, if that's the goal, what does it mean for how we reconstruct property rights, water rights, procurement contracts that actually then require that investment in innovation towards a goal? The tools, I already talked about procurement, really interesting in Brazil, what's happening, because they brought together the hunger agenda with this kind of idea of the ecological transition at the center, because in Brazil, the ecological transition is actually nested in the Ministry of Finance. Very important. So it's not far away in some department of the environment. But what does it then mean, again, to normalize it around problems like school meals? And similarly in Camden, lots of really interesting lessons in the Camden procurement work that we did on adult social care, as I mentioned, bringing the carers and the carees to the table to design and have a voice. Think of Hirschman's work on voice and exit, very important development economist, that idea of having a voice at the table. Let me just skip through. I mentioned there's 20.2 trillion in these public banks, whether it's BNDES in Brazil or the KfW in Germany. There's 2.2 trillion in the MDBs, right? These are like CAF in Latin America, the IDB, the EIB. We could actually really start thinking about really having an SDG multiplier if we imagine brought together this huge amount of money, right? 24 trillion almost, but actually aligned. Currently, there's lots of different projects being funded, but these banks aren't really working together. The MDBs don't have a strong relationship, most of them, with the SDGs. They don't have a strong relationship with the national development banks, and the national development banks, for the most part, are just giving out money to sectors in trouble. That example that both BNDES and the KfW, we did a whole study about BNDES on this because they have been a lead investor in kind of green, the green economy. It was only when Lula was very clear that the point was not just sustainability and the green revolution, but inclusive growth, that some of the loan programs in Brazil also started to have much more structure in terms of that conditionality. But if that became the norm and not the exception, this is a huge amount of money, right? So coming back to this idea that we have these financial gaps, no, we don't. There's a 7 trillion financial gap supposedly for the SDGs, but that's the same amount of money that we've seen in share buybacks by the corporate sector in the last 10 years. There's 500 billion a year just in tax avoidance. And that's 500 billion is how much we're saying every year we need for the SDGs. And yet the same amount is literally what is avoided in tax. But also in a more positive side, those are examples of the kind of dysfunction of the financial system. So over-financialization and tax evasion. But we have these public, so those need to be tackled, but also the public banks we do have, like the NDBs and the MDBs, of course, could help to direct finance. That's the whole point. That's why they're public banks. But if we don't have public purpose and outcomes orientation at the center. Capabilities matter. I already mentioned that. The key capability, I think, is that interministerial, interdepartmental approach to having an outcomes orientation. That's why we wrote also the big con, because we've really seen the decimation. This guy here is Theodore Agnew. On the back, he's a conservative Tory lord, and on the back of seeing how much money the UK government had, I'd say, wasted or spent on the Deloittes, the PwCs, the McKinseys during both Brexit and COVID, he said, what the hell? You know, we are infantilizing our civil service. We're taking away their ability to deal with the crunchiest, most interesting problems over time. And in the process, we're failing. If you look at what happened with Deloitte when it was paid 1.5 million a day to do the digital governance. And, you know, digital governance is actually hugely important, not only during a pandemic, because the infodemic, but of course for solving water and climate, how we use data that need to invest within. But there's no point in doing this if you don't have a purpose, right? Again, NASA only reinvented its bureaucracy, only reinvented its procurement because it had a goal. So we have to put these things together. There's no point. It's not a coincidence we don't invest in the civil service. It's not some right-wing conspiracy. It's because of how we've actually framed the role of government. And these kind of gov labs, I think, are super interesting, like the one in Chile, Laboratorio de Gobierno. The reward sharing, super important. How do we put these ideas of conditionalities at the center? I wrote a paper with Danny Roderick about this. We actually worked with the CHIPS Act in the US. Gina Raimondo, the Secretary of Commerce, called me about 3 years ago saying, hey, read your stuff, help us. So we managed to help her put some conditions in this massive grant, basically, that was being given out to the semiconductor sector that made sure that it wasn't just a giveaway, which was what we saw in Silicon Valley, but there was conditions that the profits being generated be reinvested back in, not just given out as dividend payouts, that those companies use energy efficient supply chains, that they treat workers better, both in terms of pay and working conditions. And those are just examples. But that's really, you know, there's all this talk about stakeholder value, but it's through that pre-distributive attention to the contracts, to the conditions, to issues around reciprocity that I think really matter. And that is what would allow us, I think, to pay much more attention to those kind of metrics that I talk about around the common good. And that's where I kind of have gotten to. And I think it's a good place to stop, just to say that all these issues that I've just brought up are the reasons why I'm like, all right, this sounds great, but these are just kind of these ideas, right? You know, outcomes orientation, contracts with conditionality at the center, reward sharing in these different ways. But all of that requires a whole narrative shift, which is why I even began with that very different story about the state in terms of the entrepreneurial state, but also looking at what can go wrong along the way. We don't just need more investment in different areas. We need to actually have a dashboard that keeps all the different actors accountable. And the reason I actually called the institute where I work, and Carlotta's a honorary professor of the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, is that that notion of purpose and public purpose, I think, has really been lost. And it's not about saying the state is great. It's actually about holding the state accountable. So one of the most interesting studies we've done recently was with the BBC, which is the only public institution I know that has taken this concept, for example, of public value seriously to hold itself accountable when it's doing things like soap operas, talk shows, documentaries, or high quality news. BBC is not perfect, but it didn't accept this idea that at best it was just there to fix a market failure. You know, high quality news and documentaries and the fun stuff by the business sector. It changed how soap operas were done. EastEnders instead of Dallas and Dynasty. And you guys are so young, you have no idea what I'm talking about. But it used to be that soap operas were just about the rich and famous. So, you know, that idea of transforming a landscape, which ultimately crowds in the private sector, but the goal is not to crowd in the private sector. The goal is to just create amazing programs that really capture that social value, but also produce industry value and also individual value. So the summation of those three is what we call public value for this work with the BBC. But this is a very empty area. There's so little work on it. And that's why, for me at least now, I'm kind of pausing, and for the next 6 months, really trying to push forwards this idea around those 5 different areas as ways along the way of doing outcomes-oriented, mission-oriented industrial strategy. How do we hold all the different actors accountable with that dashboard and really call things out when they're going wrong very early, as we saw during COVID? The vaccine was not the goal. Thank you.
Mariana, please take a well-earned seat
you.
for a
There's
moment.
40 other slides, but it's good I stopped here.
I'm looking forward to seeing what a pause looks like, given, you know, the array of things that you've shared with us and the things that you're doing as well. But it would be great now just to hear Carlota Perez. Thank you very much indeed for sharing your reflections with us.
Well, we have heard such a fantastic lecture, and that I'm not going to take much of your time. I'm going to make a couple of comments. First of all, I only work online, but I came today because it's IDS and because it's Mariana. It's always a pleasure to listen to Mariana, as you will all agree. And you know what? She's an economist. Could you have guessed it? No, because she happens to be a transdisciplinary economist. And that's a big difference between an economist and Mariana. So she doesn't ignore the state. She actually puts it at the center, defines it, signals its role as investor, as entrepreneur, as guide, and potentially aimed at the common good. She incorporates civil society, understands the complexities of innovation, which economists don't understand. So, of course, everybody in SPRU understands, and everybody in IDS does. But that's a big, important thing, because when she says innovation, she really means innovation. And what most economists see as innovation is like a manna from heaven. They don't understand anything about the complexities or the importance or whatever. It's very comforting after this long winter of free marketism that we have been living through. What has happened, thanks to this free market idea, which the standard economics has been holding for the last almost half a century, actually, 40 years, is that they've been diminishing the capabilities of the state, as she denounced in her book. They're bringing loss of well-being to many in the advanced countries. That's why the populists are winning. And this has happened every time. I mean, Hitler was elected. He actually won elections. And Trump also won elections. And they both won elections because of what has been happening. Because we have been in an economy that's been financialized. Because hundreds of thousands, millions of people have lost their future. And these populists, what they do is legitimize their anger, their very justified anger. But we don't have solutions. That's what Mariana is working on. And that's super important. Her other great virtue is that she's also an academic. She's an academic. She publishes theory all the time. She's constantly developing new, and she's now going even further. She's going to get practically a whole theory of not of the economy of development of world, or I don't know. It's going to be some very, I mean, it's been coming along. Well, she does all that, but she also works with governments. Not only does she work with governments at the top level, she works with Camden Council, and she works, at whatever level. And what she does in her teaching is precisely to get policy. So to get the things done, which is very different from just explaining. So she doesn't just criticize the injustice of the system, which we all do. She doesn't just criticize the excess profits of some, the financialization of the economy and climate disaster. She doesn't just dream of a better world, as we all do. She actually provides a way to get there. That's what she's working on, and trying to get to those dreams, not just talking about it, not just thinking how wonderful the world could be if it aimed at the common good. So guess what? She is doing it at the right moment. The state is coming back, and it is going to come back inevitably. And the unfortunate thing is that it's coming back with Trump putting tariffs, that it's coming back with all the wrong things and not following this. But if you don't have another option, then you might not be able to solve the problem. So what she's doing, and what we should all be trying to do with her, is to actually find a way to get to the dream, not just criticize and not just. So, Mariana, I'm supposed to make the first question, so I'm going to do that now. Today, you have given us a whole set of guidelines about designing missions, aiming for the common good, working with willing among the private sector, cooperating inside government, across ministries and agencies, and funding it all. Funding it all. We know it's going to require major investment, but we are at a unique moment in capitalism. That's what my new book is about. What's happening now? I mean, what has been happening throughout history with every technological revolution. The first half is this financial mess where income polarization becomes normal. When finance becomes rentier, gradually it becomes a rent seeker and no longer and decouples from the real economy, decouples from the state, which cannot regulate it. Right now, finance is a global casino. It bets, it doesn't invest in the real economy, it doesn't care what happens. If it buys stock, it's not in order to get that particular company to get better, just to make that particular company to give it more profit, to give it more dividends. So it has nothing to do with the real economy. National governments are deeply indebted, can barely fund their own commitments. COP29 was a catastrophe, partly because governments feel completely tied down by the debt that they cannot pay, or they think that they cannot pay. Global corporations are financialized. Also, the actual production, which normally in the second half of every technological revolution becomes the leader, and then it becomes, the Belle Epoque, the Victorian boom, the post-war golden age, all those moments were moments for production capital. But production capital is financialized too. And the multilateral agencies have enough funds, don't have enough funds to carry the whole burden. So Mariana, how do we fund the necessary transition for an economy geared to the common good at the global level? Do you have an answer for that?
So, Carlotta, first of all, thank you, because not only did you raise the question, but you also gave some fantastic insights, which are really very appreciative. And perhaps, Mariana, I can let you just have a first response and then
Sure.
we'll open up to questions.
I don't know what to do with
And
this.
hopefully gather a few in the room and a few online. We've had over 300 people online, which is fantastic.
Amazing.
And I can see that there's a long list of questions. So we'll do our best to fit some in, but
Okay.
please
And in
respond
the
first.
meantime, my microphone has fallen out of my backside, so I don't know how to put it back in. Backside meaning it was clamped on my trousers. So extremely, well, first of all, your work, as you hopefully know, has been a huge inspiration for so many people in this room, in my institute, and for all those people who are interested in exactly what you said, which is not just a critique, but a solution. And just to honor you as someone who has really brought together theory and a critique, a very strong diagnosis of the problems, but also lots of hope. I think we share that. Now we're both very kind of worried, but also we wouldn't get up in the morning if we didn't think we could actually design things differently. And I think that's something we share. A lot of the work that I've done is precisely in saying, if the economy is an outcome, if markets are even outcomes, then how do we achieve better outcomes? And that doesn't happen by putting the market on the side and then saying we need to solve it with non-market solutions. So how we design our public institutions, how we design our private institutions, how we govern them and how we govern their relationship matters. And we've misgoverned not only those two, but also finance. And your work on finance and the financial capitalism, the casino, the money manager capitalism, as Minsky called it, is very much at the center of the current problems we have. That's why I began with this whole notion of the financial crisis might come back. So I don't believe that there is not money. I mean, if you think of the reduced fiscal space, for example, that so many developing countries have, that's not because of, deterministic features of capitalism. Their fiscal space was reduced, right? If the conditions that were designed into the loan programs from the Bretton Woods system were conditional on reducing deficits instead of making the kind of necessary investments that both you and I talk about, of course you'll have reduction of the fiscal space. That, I mean, even in Europe, in the global north, this happened after the financial crisis, where we created money. We create money, by the way, all the time for wars, right? We don't create money for our social problems. That already is another point, right? Money is there. No one's ever said, we're not going to go fight World War II or Vietnam or Afghanistan because there's no money. We've always created money for wars because we consider them important. We don't create money for health. But if you create the money, and then you say, oh, the condition to receive it. So in Europe, the condition for the so-called pigs, Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain, the weakest part of the European Commission, that word, terrible word, came from Goldman Sachs. I'm Italian, I can say it, the pigs, Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain, absolutely terrible. They also came up with the notion of BRICS. So none of these words mean anything, by the way. The condition was that Italy, Greece, Spain had to cut their deficits. They actually ended up running surpluses in order to receive the money. Surprise, surprise, their debt to GDP goes up, right? Because they ended up cutting all those things that were key drivers, actually, also of the denominator, GDP. Spain cut its publicly funded R&D by 40% to satisfy the EU, the Troika, so-called Troika rules at the time. And then what's interesting now is the opposite happened with the current crisis. Europe woke up, they realized austerity didn't work, this false reduction of the fiscal space. They said, okay, now this time we're going to be smarter. Next gen EU, 2 trillion, right? We're going to beat the US, 2 trillion. And this is going to be conditional not on austerity, but on governments, so the member states coming up with plans. We want them to have a plan on climate and digitalization. Okay, you need to submit projects. And if you submit the projects on climate and digital, you'll get money. Italy got the most money of all of them. Why? It's easy to come up with projects. So they came up with all these projects, money arrives, and they can't even implement or administer it. And historically, Italy has given back money to Europe through the structural funds because it didn't invest in the implementation capacity. So that's the second point. These are false fiscal space reductions. Second, even when you have the money, so let's say the Bridgetown Initiative that Mia Motley is going for to give Global South countries the money they deserve to stop also wasting so much money on debt repayments, much more than they're spending on social spend, but also to really confront the climate challenges of their time, which she calls the double jeopardy, because the Global South is bearing the consequences of the climate change caused by the way the Global North industrialized. And the double jeopardy bit is that then they've set up the Global North, a financial system, international financial architecture, the IFA, which kind of messes them up on the other side, because it's exactly that system that has reduced the fiscal space, hasn't created the so-called multiplier effect that we require from the investment, because it's been constraining instead of expansionary fiscal policy. So what do we need to do? We need to tackle all these different features. We need to admit that you end up with this self-fulfilling, or how do you say, vicious cycle, that if we think that the way to grow is by cutting, then you not only don't grow, but in Europe, for example, and we definitely see this in Latin America, you get skewed growth, some countries growing much more than others. You end up, especially when there's a region, to have then redistribution, which Germany does within its landy system, but Europe doesn't do it. You end up almost with not civil war, but huge tensions. It's impossible, by the way, to have a monetary union if you don't have a union of how we understand growth. So instead of telling the pigs to cut, they should have said, hey, what should we learn about what you need? Public bank, science industry linkages, all the work at SPRU on national systems of innovation that Chris Freeman and Bankval contributed to. That's what we should have invested in Europe if we cared about innovation-led growth, which then had a direction of inclusive and sustainable. But that didn't happen, let alone in the global South, right? Which has been facing this double jeopardy, which the Bridgetown Initiative. So these are false constraints. And the other issue is that, coming back to that point about Italy, I've seen this even in many countries where I work in Latin America, even when the money is there, if they haven't invested in their capacity within the civil service, then that doesn't cause a multiplier effect. So you can create money in redistributive policies also, to, whether it's Bolsa Familia, which was successful, or other redistributive policies. But if you're not creating value, and if a progressive agenda is just about redistributing that value, or if you're creating that value in problematic ways, just through mining or whatever, of course, we know that's a problem. But if we don't have industrial strategies, outcomes-oriented industrial strategies, then of course you won't build the productive capacity of the economy. And if you're just creating money, that'll cause inflation, right? And then you get the pushback later and say, oh, the government has to step back. Inflation, of course, will happen if you have, helicopter money that's not actually finding its way into the real economy, landing in the real economy, let alone giving that economy a direction of more inclusion and more sustainability. So I just think that's important, because otherwise we often get into this idea, oh, but the global South doesn't have money. Right? So it's both, why doesn't it have money? Look at all the money that's also being wasted that is also there. By the way, the consulting problem that we raised in the Big Con is also a huge issue in developing countries. My friend who does policies around female genital mutilation in Africa, she says that 80% of the global funds for FGM just go into consultants, into intermediation. Hardly any of it actually finds itself in the front lines of the work. And we know this is true with climate as well. So I think we just need to tackle those three different things, these false fiscal spaces that we've reduced through ideology, the lack of capacity so that even when the money is created, it doesn't land and it doesn't actually create that, expand and direct the productive capacity. The fact that we have often different projects that are being funded, but if we don't have clear also regional missions, the sum is not bigger than the parts. In Latin America, it's really striking how little regional vision there is. And it doesn't help when units like CEPAL, have stopped kind of providing that kind of vision of new developmental pathways. But Barbados, for example, that I work very closely with Mia Motley, because I just find her so inspirational. She's the prime minister there. Barbados alone is not going to solve any of the problems that it's facing. Of course, the problems they're facing are outcomes of global strategies, but at least there should be a Caribbean-wide agenda, right? So there's also a Caribbean bank, the Caribbean Development Bank, but there's so many different silos and countries not actually working together. It's interesting, actually. I think in Africa, there's more of a regional plan right now than in Latin America. I mean, that's a whole other discussion. You can tell me why. But I think all these things matter because, again, coming back to COVID, those advanced purchasing agreements required actually countries also to band together, right? To think of how to do the advanced purchasing, not just for themselves, but especially where there's a regional coordination issue.
So Mariana, we'll see if we can take a few questions, and we'll take three in the room, if that's okay. And if I could just ask you to say very quickly who you are and then your question, to try and keep it fairly brief. We've got a roving microphone, which will just come. So let's start here, please.
My name is Raed Al-Zuabi. I'm a social policy research and practice PhD student and a researcher and specialist in Arab women's economic empowerment and labor force participation, entrepreneurial and formal employment. And listening to your inspiring lecture, I was reminded by these new global South frameworks beyond GDP, feminist well-being, and care economy frameworks coming out of the global South, Ubuntu, Wembibir, Marilyn Warring's New Zealand, Maori frameworks, and their call for unseating the GDP as the denominator and as the metric of economic progress, and what you think of that. And thanks again.
Great, thanks. Let's take this one.
You need to put the microphone closer to your mouth, because I don't know if everybody heard, but I found it.
Yeah. I can repeat the question when I answer it.
Okay, yeah.
Hello, hope you can hear me.
Yes.
My name is Ross. I did a master's in development studies here last year. I work in international education and a lot of state versus non-state public-private partnerships there. I really like the mission-oriented agendas you're talking about, but I wondered, since this necessarily involves, you know, all these disparate sectors coming together, how do you get people aligning on a mission in the first place?
Good, great question. Okay, and we'll take one. Yep, we can take one there.
Hi, Rhiannon McCluskey. I'm working with the International Center for Tax and Development on policy engagement. I wonder, given the current state of affairs in terms of the lack of trust and negative perceptions in government and the civil service, and the shift to the right that we're seeing in politics as well, it seems like governments feel very hamstrung. How do you think we can get to the point where governments can truly feel empowered to shape the economics that you hope to see? How can we convince the public of the value in the investment in the public sector, so that, and how can they then have the capacity not just to be more bold, but to also meaningfully foster participation in the process?
Great. Thanks, thanks, Rhiannon. So, Marianne, if we maybe take those three, we'll just try to fit in also a small number of questions from the online community, but why don't you make a start there and then we'll...
Sure. So, by the way, I didn't mention the obvious things to Carlotta, so the special drawing rights. I just assume everyone knows the big debate around the international financial architecture. I should have at least listed the obvious, but I wanted to focus also, even when that money arrives, we have a problem if we have ideology of how to create money and ideology of the capacity we need, which actually comes to that last question. So the first question, thank you so much for asking it. I often feel like I'm in too many commissions, but it's great when they actually mean something. So for the World Health Organization during COVID, Dr. Tedros, who's the head of it from Ethiopia, he asked me to chair a commission on health for all, the economics of health for all, and I made it an all-women commission. And when they asked us why all women, both Dr. Tedros and I said, why the bleep not? Look at all those commissions of all men. And one of the women was Marilyn Waring. And also Kate Rayworth, Jayati Ghosh, and some wonderful people also from Brazil, from Fiocruz, which is the big research agency there on health. And what we did was actually say, if health for all is the goal, how do you backtrack and design the economic system to deliver on it? And that's important, because otherwise we just say invest in health and it's good for the economic system. No, invest in health for all. And how do you design all the different metrics? So we looked at the dashboard that's needed around GDP, around care, all the very important work of feminist economists, but also how do we innovate differently? How do we finance differently? And how do we build capacity differently? And part of that work was actually creating this dashboard, which was an alternative to GDP, but not just with one number. In the same way that if you are driving your car and there's just one number, you would crash the car. It's not about coming up with a different, better number, but it is about that dashboard. So also the role of Kate Rayworth with her donut economics, that was part of it. My work criticizing kind of our inability to even understand rents, because as long as something has a price, we put it in GDP. So if you marry your babysitter, GDP goes down. Don't do it unless you keep paying that person, then it's fine. if you pollute, GDP goes up, right? Because you have to pay for someone. So we know all those dysfunctions from the feminist economists, the environmental economists for years. It's been half a century they've been writing it. But unfortunately, my view is that there's been really good work done on that, much less good work that goes back to taking out the rents. And I wrote a whole book about that, so I won't bore you with it. Ross, was it who decides the SDGs? Sorry, who decides the missions? I mean, that is the co-creation bit. So there's two, sorry, where are you? There you are. So there's two parts of that answer. First of all, we have signed up to these goals. So they're there. We should just take our names off if we're not interested, right? How those goals get interpreted nationally, locally, again, in Camden, they were interpreted with a true, I think, participatory process, much more interesting than I'd ever seen. It wasn't through a form that people had to fill out. It was actually through the resident associations in the housing estates. We chose 10 where the clean growth mission in Camden was going to land. And it began with discussion of what is sustainability for you? What do we mean? What do we want to do? And a super interesting thing was, because it was during COVID, the food banks, which are alive and well in this very unequal country, were transformed into green food cooperatives, where people actually own the agenda. And I can tell you, it's obvious if someone walks into a food bank, their expression, how they feel, is completely different if they actually are part of the ownership and have a voice in that bank, which is a green food cooperative, right? So also bringing new ownership structures. So it's not just co-creating the mission, but how do we actually make it land and make people feel part of something? And I really think we have lots to learn from local experiences to national and global on that real stakeholder engagement. The question about, why did I write hairspray? I'm sure I said something else here. It looks like I wrote hairspray. It obviously is not hairspray. The third question about, oh, sorry, I have no idea what I wrote there, but it was about, where are you? About the civil service and empowering. So again, the reason, Keynes said civil people, practitioners who are just out there doing good stuff, they're actually slaves of defunct economic theory. That what he meant was that it's not that people are just doing good things or bad things, they're being informed by defunct, so problematic economics that he tried to do his bit to debunk. So revealing, the first problem is revealing that what is actually being done, and this kind of disheartening that we have in the civil service, has been actually almost on purpose. There's been economic theories and economic approaches in the whole kind of new public management, the public choice theory, which has found its way into, for example, MPA programs, Masters in Public Administration programs, was designed to be actually quite disheartening. Just think of the courses that you take in an MBA program, strategic management, decision sciences, organizational behavior. It's all about strategy, thinking ahead, rejuvenating the mature corporation. If companies get big and fat and clunky and bureaucratic, they create value. We need to rejuvenate them. The multi-purpose, multi-divisional company movement back in the 80s. And that's because we know that companies create value. So we think what's going to happen when they get too big and bureaucratic. But if we don't value the civil service and the state as creating value, it's just going to redistribute, regulate, administer, de-risk, facilitate, fix markets, then it's not surprising also that the courses, literally the education being provided is very debilitating. Yeah, so that's that. And then of course, on top of that, if you have the Millet kind of government or the Musk kind of DOG, it'll get even worse. But the problem was already there before, right? So, I mean, I did a whole study about NASA, how it's transformed now into hugely problematic structures, where in order to even justify to get the budget appropriated for NASA space agency, which is the most classic mission-oriented agency, they have to talk about economic value. All the economic value that was created along the way to the moon was not done by thinking about economic value. These were dynamic spillovers that happened along the way. Even if they had blown up just before getting there, it would have still been quite successful given all that was done along the way. So how do we measure dynamic spillovers in a treasury? The Green Book in this country is used. The Green Book is part of the problem. It's all about cost-benefit analysis, net present value. So it's not just about, life coach. I was kind of kidding about that. It's literally how do we change the metrics? That's why the BBC example is so interesting, that they actually went through this process of thinking of public value because they know their role and having transformed the public broadcasting market, not just fixing it. Anyway, I could say more, but I'm sure I'm going over. And was that the last one?
We'll just take a
Oh, that's
couple of,
amazing.
we'll take a couple of questions from
I
the
have to
online
remember.
group. Just to say, all those in the room, there is going to be a reception afterwards through there. So you will still have an opportunity to engage Mariana. But we've had a very patient community online as well who've been listening in. So perhaps, Steve, we can just take a couple of questions. We'll beg everybody's indulgence for another 5 minutes, give you a chance for a final couple of responses, Mariana, and then Steve, just share with us a couple of questions.
Yeah, thanks. So we've got a question from Alan Emery, who says, broadly, the major solution required to solve climate change is the death of the fossil fuel industry. So what incentive would convince the fossil fuel industry leaders to completely transition to an energy supply system which would be less lucrative? And then another question. So a question from Jaideep Gupta, who says, hi, Mariana. Mission-orientedness requires sharp sequencing in a resource-stretched world, both globally and also locally, across the very many needs and inequalities. How do we sequence, as per the cartoon? Do we deal with the wave that's closest, largest, or easiest?
Two great questions just
Oh,
to
wow.
close off with.
Oh, my God.
There's plenty more if you
Look it out.
want.
So let me just start with the second one. That's interesting about the sequencing. So, for example, some people might even say, oh, what do you do in a country that doesn't have, whether it's an entrepreneurial state using that language or just kind of state capacity? What do we do? You know, do we first have to build the state capacity and then have the missions? They go hand in hand. I mean, that's why that NASA example was so interesting, that the only reason they had to change their capacity and their bureaucracy and how they organize their tools was they had a goal. Right. So really taking seriously this idea that, you know, what the goals are, don't ask me, I'm not going to tell any country how to prioritize their goals. But once you have your goals, which are your challenges, right, whether it's a huge digital divide, think of, again, during COVID, during the lockdown, we increased inequality because of the digital divide. All sorts of weak health systems we have globally, that made COVID so much worse. Did any of this recovery money go to strengthen the health system? So in the next lockdown, we're better off? No. And, you know, again, we had very opportunistic kind of nationalistic policies. So actually coming up with what the goals are, and I always say we did sign up to the SDGs, start with those, transform them through consensus, you know, again, citizen assemblies, resident associations, whatever democratic fora. And that's, again, where you can teach us a lot of good experiments around the world. By the way, in Brazil, they have this participatory budgeting, really interesting lessons there on that. But coming up with the goals and then making sure that that becomes the reason why we need to build state capacity, because it will be impossible to actually achieve that. It's not a coincidence that it's often when we have bad state capacity or inertial economies, so low productivity. Italy, where I'm from, has had low productivity for a very long time. That's not surprising. We have very low public investment and very low private sector investment. The UK, we are 28th in terms of business investment in the OECD. Where does productivity come from? Investment. So really using these goals to spur investment-led growth and using then the conditions, these kind of new contracts, the new social contracts, to require that investment instead of just giveaways. The public bank in Italy just gives out money to any sector that's in trouble, as opposed to that BNDES and KfW example where the public loans are given out conditional that the private sector does its job. Very important in countries also like Brazil, where the head of BNDES used to tell me, this is a huge problem in Brazil. We have capitalism without capitalists. We don't actually have all that business investment we pretend is there. And so this idea of both setting goals, building capacity that is related to the fact that you have a purpose orientation, hence things like outcomes-oriented procurement, building in those conditionalities that require that new public-private partnership. Of course we can do it. There's all these examples. Do we do it? Often not, because you have huge incumbency. There's huge profits being earned by industries, but also favors being done in governments to not do what I'm talking about, right? That's the resistance, that's the incumbency effects. But then we need to talk about that instead of just pretending it's a state capacity problem. And oh God, I have such bad handwriting. I wrote mission oriented and I wrote talk about Rachel Weaves. Oh wait, sorry, that was the sequencing. Sorry, the first one about the climate issue and how we just should almost ban, if you want, the fossil fuel industry. I think that's the wrong approach, right? The whole reason that we need transitions, take Colombia, where something like 70% of its internal energy is actually renewables. Sounds great, right? So you can say, okay, let's just get rid of all the mining. Well, you got a problem. 60% of your GDP is relying on the mining and the fossil fuel industry. So you want to just ban mining? Bang, your GDP goes down. You're going to be massively hit with, the credit ratings and all that kind of stuff. So you need a transition, but you just blah, blah, blah about that transition and make it as slow as possible so everyone's happy because nothing happens because of these incumbency? Or do you start really making the transition happen by repurposing the subsidies? By the way, how much subsidy do we have? 7 trillion. It's funny how the 7 trillion keeps coming up. There's 7 trillion share buybacks. There's 7 trillion in fossil fuel subsidies, but also the financial gap, so-called gap for SDGs is 7 trillion. Anyway, these numbers are kind of done by people, and it's always a bit of a, how do you say, window there. But the point is that the 7 trillion in subsidies, you don't just get rid of them. All that capacity, all those capabilities, and the workers who have jobs in those sectors, right? How do we repurpose the skills? How do we repurpose the subsidies? For example, making sure that all these subsidies, using the examples I've given, are conditional on these sectors changing. Think of lithium. Again, in Chile, in Argentina, in Colombia, in Bolivia, absolutely needed for electrification, right? Where do batteries come from for Tesla cars and so on? But the way we are currently extracting the lithium is extremely unsustainable and is hurting that water problem that I talked about. So how do you make sure that it's not lithium as a sector that is being, or any natural resource as a sector that's being seen as key to a country's competitiveness, but if you have a goal and a mission that then requires that sector to completely transform. In Chile, it's interesting what's happening today with mining there. In Colombia as well, Minister Andres Camacho, who's Minister of Mining, and the Minister of the Environment, Susana Mohammed, very much thinking about how to transition away from a particular way of doing mining and eventually mining itself, but you don't just get rid of mining right away. By the way, they are facing huge resistance, and that's due to the participation. The people living in those places where mining has been extracted have really been hurt. There's been war in many of these places. So unless you really pay attention to true participation, not tokenistic, oh, let's have a consultation, but true participation, bring their voices to the table. Think of the Amazon with indigenous communities. People won't trust this process and they will rebel against, even when it's progressives that are trying to the transition away from mining. So it's hugely complex. And that's why I do kind of bow down to you and your work, Peter, and your team here, because to do the participation, it's about building trust. And without trust, you have civil war. Sorry to end on that.
No, that's if. You said if, so we'll take it that. Mariana, I mean, it's actually very difficult to respond to what you've shared with us, because you have actually, I think, in the course of this hour and a half, you have covered so many of the areas that are important to us and we care about greatly at IDS, at the University of Sussex and SPRU, with our colleagues there. I think I really like the point that Carlotta, you raised, is that not only do you bring an intellectual agenda, but you're bringing a sort of practical way of thinking about pathways for a different kind of future. And increasingly, as we've spoken, you've talked about the importance of doing that collectively, inclusively, with transparency, with trust, but having an agenda that we can work together towards these common goals. You've really, I think, you're not taking language which is often used loosely and glibly for granted. You're actually unpacking that and demonstrating with many, many examples, not least the Apollo story and the moonshot, which is for us is not something we would be regularly thinking about when we're thinking about development, but showing those links between different kinds of narrative, different kinds of experience, and what that can offer for a way of working towards a shared future, which is what we all need to do to avoid those disastrous consequences that you just mentioned might happen otherwise. So I can just really say thank you so much for coming today. An incredible wealth of experience and knowledge. I think many are going to read more of your work as a consequence of what you've shared with us today. And we really appreciate you making time in what I know is an incredibly busy schedule. We've gained a huge amount from it. Carlotta, thank you to you also for being here. You said that you've come here for a very special reason, because Mariana is here, also because it's IDS, and we really appreciate, spending this time with us and sharing your wisdom and experience with us as well. For those online, thank you. You have been with us and glued, I'm sure, to your computers and your earphones for a long time, listening to this, but I hope that you have all gained from this as well. For those in the room, you're the fortunate ones, because we are going to have a little bit of time in the next room to go through and to share a little bit of refreshment and also have a bit more interaction. Those online, I'm sorry you can't join us for that. If we could do it virtually, we would, but we haven't yet.
3D printing.
Yes, yeah, there's a way to sort of work on that. That's another moonshot, I guess. But let me thank you all for coming, all those online, our colleagues from IDS communications team for facilitating all of this and making sure that all the technology worked. And we would love to have had more time for questions. I think, with these kinds of opportunities, I know there's a lot of questions there. What will be good? I guess, Steve, we've hopefully been able to save them. And there may be things that we'll continue to engage with and perhaps to follow up with some more conversations. So those of you who are here, we will now move gracefully into the next room. But on that note, Mariana, thank you so much.